Hello, my name is Zofia. Like many others at this venue, I belong to a generation that has never known a destructive collision of worlds. Now it works. As an international student, I always felt a sense of belonging to multiple worlds that intertwined and influenced one another. I felt this when I ate Italian on Saturdays with my Greek friends, discussing Austrian musicians and French politics. Always thrilling. Never before have there been so many diverse influences, multinational corporations and supranational organizations that have had an impact on our everyday life. There are hardly any nations on this world that are completely excluded from one another, economically or culturally. And that we are able to do this, I thought, was the proof that we can create something like an international community, not divided by rival self-interest, but united through mutual interest and tolerance. Doesn't that sound nice? It sounds almost utopian. Because worlds change, and we are forced to adapt. Right now, we see a return of power politics. And this change does not only have to do with how we portray ourselves outside of our borders, but also with what is happening within them. Chauvinistic populists, polarization, rallying masses. It seems like some of us want to be excluded from one another. And this sort of philosophy, it appeals to only one troublesome aspect of human behavior. Not even self-interest, but arrogant egoism. And if this is all that we reduce ourselves to, then any sort of uncivilized behavior is justifiable to us. Especially now is the time to remind ourselves that we are more than that. We are rational, compassionate beings by nature. And we take joy from connecting with others, creating communities, and being curious, because that is what it means to be a citizen of this world, to broaden one's horizons and experience a collision of cultural worlds. I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of my experiences, what I learned from it, and how it could be applied to us. So, for about 2 years, I've had a pen pal in Singapore. And she told me a little bit about the importance of the philosopher Confucius for her society. Confucius was the first to define a sort of virtue ethics of its kind, even before the ancient Greeks. He said that a sense of community could stem from a respectful attitude, a devotion to one's family, and the adherence by figures of authority to a benevolent social code. I think that having these notions of morality in the back of one's mind can be quite useful when approaching practical problems. I say this because, according to Confucius, good moral character creates a sort of harmony and is multiplied throughout life. And this is very interesting because if you actually travel to Asia, you will notice that these ideas of collective prosperity and respect are prevalent in all aspects of public life. While not technically a Confucian society, it seemed to me that when I traveled to Japan, they were also influenced by these ideas. Ooh, that was one thing too far. People cared about sustaining a pleasant public environment. There was no rubbish on the streets, and no drunks in the park, and no metro strikes as well. And even when we went to more remote and mountainous regions, the sort of quality of our experience did not falter at all. And this might seem a bit banal, might seem a bit boring, but it definitely left an impression on me. And I think it would leave an impression on anyone that has ever lived in Brussels for a prolonged period of time before, since we're used to a certain different standard of public living. You see, if you actually invest in public services for the common good, then more people will gladly use them and have an enjoyable experience. And the more people use them, the more will be invested. I do think that Western societies tend to propagate more egocentric philosophies. We do not necessarily need to be at harmony with the world if our individual needs, our individual freedoms are met. And yes, individual freedom is essential. But there comes a time where we have to ask ourselves, when does individual freedom cost us our collective security? For example, during a COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I don't want to say that collective security is not part of our Western societies at all. That's not true. It is actually one of the core ideas behind the European Union. For mutual benefit, we became dependent on one another. And this was not an act of vulnerability or an act of weakness. It was a pathway towards common strength, to ensure that worldly collision, worldly destruction does not happen again. And we created opportunities and economic growth that people could only dream of otherwise, especially in Eastern Europe. The West was the one that had to pay for the economic and social differences following the Cold War. And yet we came together under a common title, European. If it were not for this integration project, then my Polish mother and my German father would not have met. And they certainly would not be as well off as they are now, all thanks to opportunities from this project, Erasmus or the European Commission. I hope for the sake of my future and my children's future that this union does not fade, that these opportunities do not fade. But in comparison to maintaining an entire union, I suppose it's easier for self-serving politicians to jeopardize collective security and benefit. And they do this by propagating quite dangerous philosophies, philosophies that, in my opinion, are a self-fulfilling prophecy. You see, if you believe that achieving collective security and collective prosperity is impossible because everybody acts in self-interest and only seeks to gain more power, then you basically guarantee that they will do so. Because if you believe this, then of course it doesn't matter if you act amorally, if you breach international law, because everybody's doing it. And if you're not doing it, you're making yourself vulnerable and you'll be taken advantage of. And this perpetuates a cycle. But it is a cycle that we need to break. And we can only break it together. Because isn't this just such a simplistic view? Such a terrible defeat? Doesn't it put our rationality, the defining element which makes us human, to shame? It keeps us from fulfilling our full potential. Let me give you an example. Estonia, a country which has made great strides in digitalization and technology, one that countries like Germany could learn from. But now I hear from my friends in Estonia that they're scared. They're scared about their future, if they will be able to go to university and study and research and contribute towards this prosperity in their nation and our union, or if they will have to stay home and defend their families and join an army. War is messy and expensive. Military industrialization, modern weaponry, and ever more complex international relations make it horrific. We only fight war to preserve peace. The only reason for war is its end. Now is the time for us to remind ourselves that we do have innate virtue and a notion of morality. Yes, we make errors in our judgment. We're not perfect. Nobody is. And oppressive regimes and misguided individuals will try to take advantage of that. But that does not mean that we shouldn't try. And I know that sounds super cliche, and I understand that. But I think that we need to understand that civilization is cumulative. We learn from the past and from each other, and we build on it. And of course, we won't ever live in a perfect utopia. That's impossible. There will always be conflict. But if more of us held this supposedly naive hope of peace and collective prosperity, then maybe we could make a difference. We could find common ground. We could link morality with politics. And we could come out stronger because of it. Thank you.